everyone. Welcome to another episode of Gray Matter. Well, in our lives today, there's an awful lot of talk about war. We see war happening over in Europe, escalation of what's happening in Ukraine and Russia. We hear every day about what's happening in Gaza, the ongoing conflict there, and how it's made its way over to our shores in North America, to our universities and the streets of Los Angeles and places like Toronto and Montreal. So, we talk about war, but what is war really? Most of us have not experienced it up close. So I thought it'd be great to have somebody on the program today who has done that, and not only done that, but has written a really interesting book about it. A book of poems which actually get you as close as possible to what it's like, to what are the emotions, what are the thoughts, what goes through your mind, what are the reflections upon war. And his name is Ryan McDermott. Welcome to the program, Ryan. It's great to have you on to talk about your book.
Thanks for having me on today.
Yeah, I'm excited to dive into it. It's called Downriver, Memoir of a Warrior Poet. It's about more than just war, but there certainly is a warrior theme, and really a victorious one, a heroic one, if you will. And I love that part of it. Before we get into it and introduce him properly, as we always do, we're going to go through our framing aphorisms. Today, I thought we'd do something a little bit different and just go through some of the incredible reviews that this book has received. From General David Petraeus, a retired U.S. Army, he says, "Few war memoirs achieve the level of literary depth and emotional resonance of Downriver. And even fewer help us understand the burden of leadership in combat and the resilience required to forge a new path beyond the battlefield." And then from William Doyle, who's an author of his own book, A Soldier's Dream, he says, "This is an epic account of one young man riding the torrents of 21st century American history, navigating a tumultuous voyage through military and business combat and personal turmoil toward enlightenment, redemption, and self-discovery. A remarkable, vivid, and inspiring story I will never forget." Wow, that's quite a recommendation from a fellow author. And then from Kirkus Reviews, who said, "A compelling and unflinching personal story about his winding road toward wholeness and healing." I could hear an old Beatles tune in the back as I read that, Winding Road. One of my favorites by them, actually. And then from Book Life Reviews, revealing memoir of the Iraq War, the financial crisis, and a soldier's will to succeed. That's quite a broad spectrum, quite a big package. So who do we have on the show today? Well, Ryan McDermott, as we said, he's the author of Downriver, Memoir of a Warrior Poet. He is an executive in the aerospace and defense industry and a former senior Pentagon official specializing in national security policy, finance, and government relations. He's a U.S. Army veteran. He served from 2000 to 2006, leading a platoon into combat with the 3rd Infantry Division during the 2003 invasion of Iraq, which, of course, we've all heard a lot about. He's a recipient of the Bronze Star Medal and earned the Ranger Tab in Combat Infantry badge. And following his service there, he transitioned to Wall Street and Lehman Brothers before its 2008 collapse, which is has to be a very fascinating story in itself. He's a West Point graduate. He holds an MBA from the Darden Graduate School of Business at the University of Virginia and an MA in Security Studies from Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service. Well, Ryan, welcome to the program. I thought it would be great if you wouldn't mind, just by way of introduction to the people who don't know you or about your book, if perhaps you could give us a bit of a reading to kind of lead us into the discussion of your book and why you wrote it.
Absolutely. I'll have to set this up. I have to set up the book, or the sort of the way it's structured and what I'm
Sure,
going to
please
read.
do.
So the book sort of starts with a rock bottom moment. It's a little cliche. In 2011, sort of everything kind of sort of unpacked and unwound, and sort of that was my moment. And then that was the moment that I then turned and looked backward. And so what I'm about to read is something from that process, and then afterwards I'll give a little bit more context of the journey. So the introduction is "Remains of the Night," and I open with this quote: "The secret to happiness is freedom, and the secret to freedom is courage." And that was interpreted by Thucydides.
Mm-hmm.
The evening was cool and damp in the early spring of 2011. Clouds drooped over the nation's capital, creating the faintest fog as I walked along the Potomac River Trail from Georgetown to the Lincoln Memorial. My mind replayed the battles I thought I'd left behind. Between the deserts of Iraq in 2003 and the trading floors of Lehman Brothers in 2008, I now had to fight to save myself and cope with losing my marriage. I ruminated on memories that, in Lucy's absence, held painful memory. Our love story, one for the ages, was over, and after I got home, I wrote a poem. Throughout my adult life, I've written poetry whenever I felt an intense emotions that demanded some expression. Each poem represents a cathartic journey inspired by an emotion or an experience, iterated countless times until it finally translates into art. I search for a rhythm and tempo to reach conclusion, and when it is completed, I gain a sense of closure. Remains of the night. As I lie here still, awaiting the light, I wonder how to fill the remains of the night. Another dream fills my mind that we come to find our love again shining bright. But now, each day, we become strangers, while regret in my heart still lingers. As the sun rises, I awake with the light, realizing there is nothing of life in sight. Only cold soot and ash remains. As lightning is bound to the reins, so too the fire that burned bright, now extinguished, leaving nothing but charred stains, remains of the night.
Wow. I can see why that received such rave reviews from some of your colleagues, both in the military and also, in terms of your literary college. One of the things that's interesting to me about poetry and about poets, Ryan, my first degree was in English literature, so I've spent a lot of time in poetry. I've tried to write poetry myself, discovered I wasn't very good at it. And so, what's interesting to me is that oftentimes, poets and poetry come from unlikely sources. And I would say that's true of you. You say that you've written poetry from time to time growing up, but from your background, as illustrious as it is, in terms of your educational background and your military history and success in the corporate world, you don't present as somebody who we would suspect as being a poet. So, from whence does this poetic muse come for you? Where does it all begin for you?
Well, I think that's an interesting, this is kind of a theme of the book because the warrior poet, I think, is someone who's a warrior who deals with challenge, trauma, and turns it into something positive, reflective, and looks for a higher meaning. And so
Mhm.
for me, it's poetry. Others I know do painting and so forth. As I look back, poetry is born out of some emotion, I think.
Right.
And
Mhm.
then, there's actually a purposeful aspect of what I do in my book because if you go to the West Point chapter and start reading, you're going to see some very simple and basic poems that are of minimal skill, that sort of thing. And I try not to, so I don't, and so there was a development process where if it's I try to show that in the gradual, hopefully a gradual improvement in skill of pulling together a better poem. But I think it's born out of a need to express something about about the either the emotion or the experience a person's dealing with. Um, and it's something different than writing a story, which I think has a different sort of purpose to it.
Right, right. And of course, your poetry, is the type of poetry that I think, most people can relate to, because, I would say I would describe your poetry as emotive, in the sense that, although I don't wanna downgrade it and say, that it doesn't have intellectual depth because at certain times, some of the poems, the ones that I saw in the book do have that. But it seems to me that, what you're driving at always is to express emotion and perhaps even relate an emotion to other people. And poetry as a literary genre, really has a unique ability to do that, doesn't it? And you think of music really as just poetry, set to music, but it's really that lyrical quality that can really, reach people, and it seems to me that's your style of poetry. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I think absolutely do. I think it's accessible. I'm not trying to make sort of the poet laureate or anything like that. I mean, I think if anything, there's a sort of aspect to open the door of like, hey, make it a broader sort of, it's more accessible. People, it doesn't have to be for the world. It can be just for yourself. But I think it's an interesting thing for me. For me, it was something interesting to have kind of along the way because sort of work on different ones and improve them over time. But you hit the nail on the head of kind of like where my sort of the reasoning why and sort of categorizing the type of poems they are.
Mhm. And I love the image of the metaphor of a warrior poet. Of course, I think, of people like King David in the Old Testament, and some of the Psalms that he left to us. But talking about being a warrior, in order to be a warrior, you always have to face adversity and try to overcome adversity, and that's a big part of what you write about. Do you wanna talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. There's different adversities I talk through in my book. The first one, major one, is the family. As I was getting ready, waiting to get accepted to West Point. I hadn't gotten accepted. My mother and stepfather, we lost our house, and there were some other aspects of that made my senior year of high school very challenging.
Were you from a military family, Ryan? Is that what drew you to West Point?
Well, I had my grandfather on my mom's father had served, and and there were other folks, like my uncle had been in the military, he was in the army, but it wasn't like direct. It was sort of like I knew people in my family that were in the military. So I was working, working class growing up, and I've looked at the role models of like people who I looked at military service as a down payment for my hope to have the American dream. And
I see.
yeah,
Mhm.
and so it was like an obligation that if I wanted to have a better life, that serving in the military would make that more achievable.
Mhm. And so you go to West Point ultimately, and what was life like for you there? Did you find that you fit in, or did you find that, the sort of regimented life of highest level military college was something that was too structured and was stultifying for you?
Well, it's interesting. There's multiple aspects to this. First, my chapter on West Point is different than any other memoir about West Point because I don't talk about I talk a little bit about West Point at the beginning of it and then focus more on what I dealt with. So while I was there, my mother was actually in a woman's shelter for a period of time, and
Mm,
so
wow.
she was my core support, and so I wrestled with that, and I didn't feel comfortable, you know, telling others about that, and that vulnerability I kind of masked over. Um, the discipline and routine of that place definitely weighed on me, and that's where the poetry, sort of having an outlet, a creative outlet, was
Right.
really important for me
Mhm.
because it gets to be pretty mundane. But the discipline also I felt and sort of structure was helpful because it helped develop my character, my abilities across the board, and just in general capacity to become a better leader.
Mhm. One of the things in your history that appears to have shaped you as a person and also impacted your poetry is a kind of a tumultuous upbringing. You talk about the experience of losing your childhood home to foreclosure. What was that moment like for you, and how did that impact you going forward? Did you find that it changed the way you saw the world and made you more ambitious, or did it make you angry and resentful?
Well, I think the emotion of anger and resentfulness it gets in the way of any sort of progress. So definitely not that, because I think if that had happened, I would have gone a path. And I kind of mull over this a little bit in different chapters in terms of like, you know, understanding like, okay, here's the pattern that befalls my family members. So my uncle's resentful, angry at the world in a sense, turned to alcoholism and failure and sort of roots of failure. And so for me, I think that my adaptiveness through that process was to try to find hope and some optimism about the future, about my future, and so forth.
Mhm.
It's you know, and I don't know, like that was shaped in some ways by my mother. So my mother was a very hopeful and optimistic force in my life, and that's something I talk about in the chapters that lead up to her breakdown. So that culminates in my sort of childhood is my mother's dream of having a better life for me and my sisters. It erodes and deteriorates into us losing our home. The marriage falls apart. She falls apart personally and professionally as I'm getting ready to go to West Point. There was a family that took me in, which was very helpful. So I wouldn't have succeeded if this family did not take me into their home and offer support while I was at West Point. So I think for me, my faith was a foundational of support through the process, and so there's a little bit of a sort of circularity of decisions and behavior patterns that start to play in there, and that's where the self awareness. You know, one things I would add about the book in terms of structure is it's bounded by 4 counseling sessions, and I want to
Mm,
destigmatize the I want, professional class, right? I'm a
right.
professional, and I think it doesn't matter how smart you are, it doesn't matter how successful you are. In fact, if you're very successful, it's possible that you have some personal things that you could work through as well. And so there are these counseling sessions that kind of package each part of the book. First part is my West Point sort of upbringing, then the Iraq War, and then the Lehman Brothers chapter. And
Hmm.
those parts I think are meant to kind of show that there's a reflective piece to take some lessons forward.
Hmm. Well, let's talk about the Iraq War and how that impacted you. So this is around 2003 when you're deployed there, correct?
Yeah,
And
so
yeah,
yeah, my wife and I, we had sort of in the aftermath of 9/11 got, really moved forward with our relationship very fast. Got married, had a baby, and in 2000 January 2003 was when I deployed to Kuwait in the lead up to the Iraq War.
right. And so what were your expectations going over there? I mean, I remember that time, and it was a time of intense patriotism, especially in America. Um, w- what was your expectation going there in terms of you going over to Kuwait? What did you expect to find, and how did that accord with your expectations going in?
That's interesting. So, the life of a soldier at that time. So, as a soldier, my experience leading up to that was we did a training exercise in October, the prior October, that mirrored what we thought we were gonna see in Iraq. And so, from a war planning perspective, I think there was an expectation we were gonna have to go to war, and that's what you do. That's kind of the expectation you want soldiers to be. If they're going to have to go to war, you want them prepared and thinking they are, and then you pull, if you're not, then you pull them back, and so forth. So we very much had a mindset that of preparedness to do follow the orders. Now there's broader stuff going on, like like for us, once we got into theater, it's sort of we're listening like everybody else. There's a chain of command, but we're listening to the radio and so forth, about expectations about what's going to happen. um I we kind of knew exactly like what the war plan was in terms of the ground campaign, and I talk a little bit about that, but because it's interesting when you know that, for me, knowing that as I was going to have to lead soldiers into certain battles, and there's one in particular for a bridge over the Euphrates. you know you're dealing with the sort of like that's going to be a moment where there's going to be people likely shooting at us,
Hmm.
and so you're really focused as a soldier at that point and a leader on, okay, I need to get my soldiers home alive. I need to accomplish the mission. And that's the most important thing is the trusts and bonds with the people you're serving with.
Hmm. The the aftermath of that war, as we look sort of 20 years uh, into the past, there have been tremendous attempts by Hollywood and the media, especially on the left, to try and paint what happened over in Iraq as similar to Vietnam. But I can recall that was not the feeling at the time. I can recall the sense that this was a very just war and that it was very important. Was that your sense at the time, or were you disillusioned by what you experienced over there?
There's some nuance to this. This is a challenging question because hindsight is 2020, right?
Right,
And
right.
and it's I try not to go too deep into this in the book. There is a part where I go into later because, I had come out of the army and there's some regret. So part of publishing is there's some probably guilt in having left the army, and friends of mine continue to serve. I did one deployment. Who am I to write? There are people that serve multiple tours in Iraq, multiple tours in Afghanistan, and people who've died. Um, that's war is a it's I think history is still to be written about this because we talk about taking down Saddam Hussein. If you frame it that way, it has a certain context to it, right?
Mm.
He was an evil person. I don't think anybody is going to suggest that Saddam Hussein should have been left in power.
Unless they're evil people themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
um the challenge, this is something I think, and I don't we can't it's going to be it's almost impossible for me to kind of even begin to sort of peel back the layers on this. But one thought about reconciling this for the book is kind of coming to some understanding of the past sufficient enough that I can then focus on what's important, which is really the future,
Right.
right?
Mhm,
And I
mhm.
think that is what's really important about, I think one of the good things, I want to show, like in this book, I want to show like people who served and sacrificed in the war, Iraq war and the global, and Afghanistan, sort of have pride in what we did. We were tasked to do these missions.
Right.
I don't, I try to stay away as much as possible from the foreign policy critiques and
Mhm,
so forth
mhm.
because um, I'm not sure if it's not my goal necessary to kind of carry that on. There are some lessons I think need to be carried going forward, but that's sort of a separate thing. But
Mhm.
my hope, I don't know if you have one of the things I'm very proud of. So you read the David Petraeus praise.
Right. Mhm.
There's also a Gold Star parent who I reached out to, who offered one as well. And I'm very, and then there's people who's like the commanders who served,
Right.
because writing a story, there's some stories that that play very well with the literary critics, right? Oh, this is great, but then it it sort of diminishes the service of those who preceded, who actually fought in the war, right?
Right. Right. Right.
And but at the same time, I don't. It's sort of so I'm sort of proud of the fact that, one, it's gotten some literary praise, and then two, the people who served. Um, it's a story that, at least for them, they can resonate.
Mhm. Well, I don't think that, your length of service would ever disqualify you from being someone who, who is qualified to write about the experience. And you think of Norman Mailer, I don't think he served at all in World War II, but I think we can agree he wrote the definitive novel, The Naked and the Dead, on the experience of World War II service in the South Pacific. Um, but what I really wanna know is, comparing the poetry you were writing at West Point, to what you were writing over in Iraq. How did that experience affect your poetry?
Well, definitely darker. And some of it, most of it's actually after. So some of it, is sort of the longing for home. There's a couple poems in there about going to war and miss it, because it's a love story. I mean, there's what is unique, I think, about the memoir is that it's really, the foundation of it is about a desire for family. There's a love story. And as you get to the historical events like Lehman, Iraq, they're there, but there's hopefully a little bit in the background of the personal story.
Mhm.
There's a couple poems. There's one, I was going to try to look it up here, about, there's a guy, there's one about coming home. There's one in here where we, sing, there's a bridge. Let me see if I can find it here because it's a very short one. It's the end of, do you mind if I read? It's just like very,
No, please do. I think it's important that people get a sense of,
okay.
what the poetry is like.
Yeah, this one, and this is very short, and here's how it ties together, right? So again, the way to think about this is the prose is meant to kind of paint the picture. The poetry is meant to kind of convey the emotion. So this part, we had just secured the bridge over the Euphrates River. We had fought this battle, pretty intense, over the Euphrates. That's where the the U.S. Army eventually crossed at one point
Mm-hmm.
on its way to Baghdad. And so my platoon was the first to cross the bridge over it as a mechanized unit. And so it was a big battle. It hasn't really been written about as much, so I think there's a historical aspect to this particular battle. At the end of the battle, I meet with my company commander, and then I walk off, and I describe this scene. Staring at the soldier's remains, I sensed no life. The blood stains on his clothes were already turning brown. His body remained fixed in an unnatural contorted position. You don't see dead people all that often, but when you do, it's obvious that they're dead. Most people only see the deceased at funerals. It was difficult for me to imagine that the soldier had a life before this battle and that he had died only hours before. I'm sure he had loved ones and possibly children, but I did not think about it in that way at the time. His body became an artifact of the battlefield, much like a destroyed vehicle or other inanimate object that would only be moved when it was necessary to do so. My men were war fighters who needed sleep and food. I decided to leave the body there until the next morning when we moved it to a more suitable location. Quote, the end of war. There must be peace in death as the body lies still. The man has taken his last breath. His remains begin to chill. No more battles will be fought, yet I have many more. Though I wish to stop, I cannot, for only the dead know the end of war.
Mm.
So, and that kind of concludes that. It's a very short poem that kind of sort of wraps up that chapter,
Mm-hmm.
because there's a recognition that in war, you're pushing, and you don't really have a time to sort of process the gravity of the situation,
Mm-hmm.
and you have to continue even though so there's no rest until it's over. And the point, kind of using the popular phrase of only the dead know the end of war, I thought was a kind of an obvious tie in there.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious, Ryan, what was your sense of being over there? Of course, being the Euphrates has incredible biblical significance. What was your sense of being over there and being in these places that you'd only read and heard about? Did that impact your poetry at all?
Well, there's definitely a sense of history when I was over there, and as a some of the historic biblical sites you just described, we were going through, which was kind of surreal,
Mm-hmm.
and this was playing, and you realize that whole action was going to be a very small part in the landscape of it. I'm not sure if I reflected adequately on all that, and I think where you're going. I was honestly just trying to survive day to day. I will say that the spiritual part of it, very much so, and because when you're in war, you don't. For me, I thought deeply about, okay, is your soul ready? Am I doing the right thing?
Right.
Um, and are we? Is this going to go well? If not, I mean, there's a lot of thoughts that go through your head. And you know, as a theme with the book, there's, what really matters is getting to a point of focus of the moment and into the future to kind of guide the right, to the best path forward, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you emerge out of the war.
Mhm.
And then you enter a new, perhaps just as dangerous battlefield in some ways, and that's the big financial world, and you end up at Lehman Brothers. What drew you there, and what was that experience like for you during that time?
Well, there's an important intermediate chapter here, a couple chapters about coming home, because after I got home, there's sort of this, hey, this is the happy ending, this sort of part two, the end of part 2. Reunite with my wife, my newborn, my 1-year-old son or 9-month-old son at the time, and yet I still had time to serve in the army, and so I didn't immediately go to business school. I went on a staff, and then I was stop loss. So there's a whole chapter, and it's a very important chapter,
Hmm.
on the rear detachment mission, which was basically as when my unit for the second deployment in 2005, I was a stateside officer working
Mm,
with families, FRGs, doing casualty affairs,
mm,
work as well. And I will tell you that this was something that was important is the service and sacrifice of the families, uh, the loved ones. Their soldiers deploy for a year. They get to see them a week or two. I think it's about 2 weeks out of that whole year, somewhere mid as a mid tour sort of leave.
mhm,
And besides that, they don't get to see them, and they don't know when there's a call going to come, somebody's going to show up at their door. Very important chapter in my book as I sort of went off to business school, and I also convey some of the early nightmares. There's a poem that's actually a nightmare, literally a nightmare described as a written poem, and some other nightmares as well. And, I didn't really think as much of it going to business school. Once I get to business school, that was where I lost the Army community, or I didn't lose it. I didn't have the Army community as a support. That was where the civilian military integration transition, I had some friends, but it wasn't like the Army. And that began kind of the sort of some of the issues as we go, I've got
mhm.
to get the job at Lehman because I need to pay for business school now, right?
Right,
I
right,
got to get the intern, so I got to get the internship, but then I got to get the full-time offer to get the bonus money to pay for this, next year. And it's
right.
like the golden handcuffs, which is actually a poem in the book about,
Mhm,
sort of doing that, pursuing that path because it was necessary. But then kind of losing myself in the process of like really eh, focus adequately not I was not adequately focused on my family at the time.
Mhm, mhm. Where your treasure is, where your heart be also.
Mhm.
And of course, part of the story of the book is, um, rising from adversity, building a life that you were told to believe in, like many other people. You were sort of chasing after the quote unquote American dream and working very hard at that. And from all accounts, from all perspectives, doing very well. And then something really terrible happens, and that's the financial crisis of 2008, and that sort of becomes a full stop, a big sea change in your life. Do you want to talk about that and how that also affected your poetry?
Yeah, absolutely. That was a time where, again, 2007, it was the peak. And so I'd done my summer internship, taken the bonus money, and then a year later showed up for training. And it was August of 2008. And it was obvious you know, that Lehman was in trouble. The
mhm,
question was whether or not the Treasury Department or the Fed was going to bail out Lehman because it looked like a systematic issue. And so I definitely felt so during that time. I didn't really reflect during that time. It was afterwards that I did the writing. So working, 100, I mean, it was weird. There was not a lot of business going on, but it was like 100-hour work weeks. Because people just wanting to make sure they're at work. Uh, there was a point where the firm went bankrupt, but then it got bought by another bank, and then it was the post merger integration where eventually I got laid off. And they were generous, like there was generous sort of package, but it was still a very difficult economy, and everything that I kind of put my hopes and aspirations from a career perspective just was like that was done,
mhm,
and so there's a point where I described going on a run over the, George Washington Bridge, and it was like dark. It was cold. This was after I lost my job, and there's a park in Inwood, and ran all the way through. And I used to be able to run across the GW Bridge like nothing. Like, hey, I'm confident, everything. But for whatever reason, I described this in the book. I just got vertigo over the bridge, and I felt all
mm,
the feelings of stress of not knowing what the future was how that was gonna play out.
mhm.
And I think that's something that a lot of people I think feel is there is this anxiety about the future, potentially if they don't know, okay, what does the future look like? Do I have a
Right.
job in this changing world? If I don't, do I have the ability to kind of get from point A, feed my family? It's not just me. I could live in, I could go sleep on the side of the street, but I got to provide for my kids. I got to provide for my family. So.
Mm-hmm. Um, Folks, we were talking with Ryan McDermott. He's author of a book called Downriver, Memoir of a Warrior Poet. He's read a couple of excerpts from the book. Be interested to hear from you in the comments about what you think about the poetry and the concept of Ryan's book. So, Ryan, at what point did you conceive the idea, or maybe did you always have the idea that at some point you'd put these poems and your story to pen and paper and create this book?
That's a great question, because this book has gone, it's been a product of a lot of writings. So one major intellectual product that was my journal at West Point. That's for me. It wasn't for anybody else. I also had, like, in that journal, poems that I wrote, again, for me, not for anybody else. This was just, things that I had worked on and so forth. I get back from Iraq. I started writing chapters from about the war, like, loosely an idea. I didn't know what a story would be, so I started writing chapters about that. I go to business school, and there are some courses there about, leadership and really understanding your past. And so I wrote from more of a lens of understanding my past. There was another one where I began to write more dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
And so it stayed on the shelf. And then I get to, after Lehman collapses, I decided, I lost my job. I decided to wrote those chapters, the initial draft. And then I began to piece it together as sort of an exercise of catharsis, but also just a project that I could see myself as I'm trying to put my story together. I'm trying to put myself back together after all this, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Personally and from a career perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's now the epiphany moment came about 4 years ago to kind of integrate the poetry into it. My mom was like, hey, you ought to, like, consider, this can kind of tie in as like a way to connect the reader to the moment. And I
Yes.
just realized, like, hey, I'm just gonna put it all out there in the way I want to. I layered in some of the counseling sessions as well to kind of segment the story. But the poem, so the title of the book, Downriver, is actually the poem at the very end, and it's a poem that I wrote for my then estranged wife in 2011, and it was kind of this recognition. It replayed a little bit of our love story that the book actually plays, and then it's just this idea that, keep going, don't quit, just keep going downriver, looking for a place to cross the water. And that's kind of
Mm-hmm.
this idea of, like, coming back to myself and to my family to a degree. And so the title of it is both, it ties to that theme of the book, but it's also sort of the titular poem of the book at the very end. It's a rather long poem. Um, so once I got to that, I realized that's what it needed to be. And this tying in the sort of model of the warrior poet is a deeper, it's not just a warrior or a poet, it's someone who brings together, and I'm still trying to be one. I'm not necessarily saying I am one, right? um, there's a lot of people who, you brought up some other models. There's, I remember Braveheart, the movie Braveheart with Mel Gibson,
Right.
sort of introduced this idea, and that's kind of right as I went into West Point, was kind of that idea of someone, because there has to be meaning. And I think that's what's important in our society, is that our warriors have that sort of mindset of a deeper meaning about, our role in society shouldn't just be mindless drones. There has to be meaning that's tied to our societal values.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And your story really is one that has something particular to say about the American dream, doesn't it? Because in many ways, you lived it. You come from a difficult upbringing, a lot of love there, from what I understand. But let's face it, difficult circumstances you had to overcome. You get accepted to a very prestigious school, perhaps the most prestigious military school in the world. You have that experience, and then you're involved in war. You're a decorated soldier, and then you go back to school, and you become part of the high level financial world. But what's interesting is that none of those things seem to get you to the destination that you are chasing. There's something else deeper, and I think this is kind of the point of some of the poems in your story. There's a deeper meaning uh, to what you were chasing after, whether you realized it or not, and that also has something to say about the deeper meaning of the American dream. Would you agree?
Yeah, I do. I absolutely do. And that deeper meaning, and I don't know if you're going this way, but the deeper meaning for me is there's a spiritual aspect of it, of getting
Right.
of spiritual wholeness. Yeah.
Right. That's what I wanted to ask is, it seems to me what got you through the sort of the light that got you through so many difficult situations and really that is the muse in a lot of your poetry, it seems, is your faith. And that's been a source of strength for you and guidance and wisdom. You said catharsis. So your faith is very strong, and that's been an abiding thing throughout your life. And do you want to talk about how that has influenced you and how you've been able to keep going and to translate into this beautiful poetry that you create?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. The faith is one thing, and you know, through my children, I mean, I'll tell you, just like that is where the purpose of to keep going is in my children, and the faith of trying to do the right thing. My son Brandon wrote the laughter word, and I think it's an honest, I didn't want to I wanted to make sure it was an honest sort of appraisal, and I could read some of that. You know, there are other poems in the book that are very spiritual. There's sort of one about heaven, sort of a dream I had about, being on the shores of heaven, and then equating that same poem, actually drawing a poem to seeing my son born for looking into his eyes and realizing, you know, in his eyes, I walk the shores of heaven, because there's no greater sense of purpose I could have than to help this young human being thrive in this world and be protected.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm.
and there's some other, there's some darker ones that also have a spiritual aspect to it. And there's one at the very end. It's a short one, if you don't mind. It's
No, please do.
yeah, this is before Brandon's afterward. This is kind of how it ends is, looking forward, I am filled with hope and determination. I have new goals, reinforcing a norm of mental health awareness and proactive treatment among our military and veteran communities, and helping the broader public understand how traumatic experiences can be transformed into personal growth. The crucible of every warrior poet, that's what the crucible of every warrior poet is. My professional journey continues to evolve, driven by a deep desire to contribute meaningfully to support our warfighters and ultimately our national security. Through it all, poetry remains my solace and voice. It captures the essence of experiences and emotion. Each poem provides me closure and perspective and readiness to embrace the future. The poem New Horizon. Walking the banks of the river to the sea, where the waves climb upon the shore, there is a well-beaten path to a jetty that dives deep where it meets the ocean floor. Far too long have I dwelled on traumas past. My warrior heart now seems at last. Embracing the path before me, I look to the swimming in the ocean. Gripping hands with those before me, I embrace the promise of a new horizon.
Mm.
And what that is actually insinuating is kind of like the journey out to the horizon is actually, the afterlife in some sense. It's not there's this, the river of life as we go eventually join the ocean is it's kind of this recognition that, our journey is going to go through these winds and twists and so forth, and that at the goal is a beautiful thing in that sense.
What a brilliant message, and it's obviously impacted many people. One review that I found of the book, I just want to share this with our listeners. It says the writing at times, talking about your book, just knocked the wind out of me. That's a pretty strong statement. It says his use of poetry throughout, like the haunting remains of the night that we heard a little bit of, adds emotional punch in all the right places. When he writes about leaving for war in Saying Goodbye, or about the surreal emptiness of returning home and coming home, he says, I didn't feel like a reader. I felt like I was there, sitting beside him, taking in the same blows. The style is clean and unpretentious, yet layered with meaning. And it says even the way that he describes mundane things like living off canned tuna in a DC apartment feels heavy with metaphor. And it says this guy doesn't just tell you what happened, he makes you feel why it mattered. And I think you've told us why you're able to do that, because you're not sort of playing with words here and trying to be clever. What you're doing is you're relating real emotions. And that seems to come across very well in the book. So looking at this sort of retrospectively, now that you've published the book and hopefully it's doing very well and selling lots of books, and folks will tell you again, the name of the book is Downriver, Memoir of a Warrior Poet. Ryan, I'm interested to know, obviously, the book has been very, very well received in various quarters. How has it changed your life, being a published author now of this book? And has it inspired you to go on and write more poetry and perhaps publish additional volumes?
Well, appreciate the question. I think, one, I've just been trying to get, focused on getting it launched and out there into the world. This, I'm a no name, so nobody knows me, but that's part of the story. I mean,
Not anymore.
well, I will say that like, that is part of the story is meant to be like, the path of focusing on, really what matters and so
Right.
forth. And so I had this vision and hope that this book will be something that people gradually tell other people and people read and potentially, I gave it to my son before he went to West Point to
Mm.
kind of give him like some of my life lessons of like what not to do, infer and just to understand me. And so there's kind of this hope that I hope that, I've got, it's in the West Point bookstore and maybe some young cadets will read it because they're, these are the future leaders. I want to sort of pass that message on that, to be, there's a lot of the book is not, is I show, I don't tell people exactly. So you're going to take something different. Everyone's going to take something different from how you read it.
Right.
But I'm really focused on that piece right now. There's in getting, how there's somebody I shared it with recently, or like during the preview phase, I was like looking to get some different, a veteran. We were colleagues and I wouldn't say we knew each other well. Kind of like, okay, meet and work environment and so forth. I sent it to him and he wrote, I don't want to tell you which review he wrote, but he basically said I had a different perspective. This is on Amazon.
Mhm.
He thought it was going to be just me telling like war stories, right?
Right.
And then he realized it was much more comprehensive about the life and, sort of just he said, he used the term, showing yourself vulnerable.
Right.
And we got lunch and he opened up to me of things that he'd been through like recently. And I was like, wow, that's a lot. And, just, I think, he had been through a divorce and so forth.
Mhm.
And, and what it kind of made me feel is like, wow, and he conveyed this, it's like, he could see in my story that he was not alone. Right.
Right.
Others have gone through this. And I think, and I think men, we mask, we sort of bury ourselves of like in this facade of invulnerability. And, and this idea, and I think I don't know if this is a good thing, is this sort of mentality of like, you can't break, you got to keep fight, sort of don't ever, you should never quit, but it's okay to break. And
Right.
there's this quote, and I don't know if you saw that there's a quote at the end. I quote Hemingway about, the sort of, because I think it's a great quote. It's from A Farewell to Arms. It's the one where he talks about, see if I can find it here, but he talks about war, the world breaks everyone, and afterwards,
Right.
some are strong at the broke places.
Mhm.
Most people
Mhm.
stop that quote right there. I think the rest of it's equally important. But those that will not break, it kills. It kills the very good and the gentle and the very brave and partially. If you are none of these, you can be sure it will kill you too, but there will be no special hurry. And the way I interpret it, and I thought it was a perfect quote to kind of wrap up the epilogue, is that, my view, what Hemingway was talking about there was this idea that you got to let go and, in a sense, break, not quit, but you allow yourself to break, and that creates, like in civil engineering, like you don't a fixed axis will break and fail catastrophically. But if you have those, if you're able to bend, it gives you much more structural strength. And I think that that's the analogy I try to use, is that vulnerability is a foundation of strength. Is counterintuitive, but one that I think that, if it's in practical terms, it's like, hey, if you realize if you realize you need support, ask for support. You know, if and I think that's a proactive way of saying that is a strong thing to do.
Hmm. Well, if that's the only message that people draw from your book, I think it will have been well worth the read and well worth the journey. Folks, we've been talking with Ryan McDermott, author of Downriver, Memoir of a Warrior Poet. We appreciate getting getting your comments on this episode and what you think about the book and the poetry that you've heard. And if you like what you've heard, please share this with 3 friends. We want to spread the word about this compelling author and his great new book, which is being added to our reading list. And I'll just give you the sort of description that's on Ryan's website. It says, "We all face trauma. How we confront it defines who we become." Downriver follows Ryan McDermott on a gripping, deeply personal journey through war, ambition, loss, and redemption. From losing his childhood home to foreclosure to facing the unseen scars of the 2003 Iraq invasion and navigating the cutthroat world of Wall Street at the moment of its 2008 collapse. McDermott's experiences reflect the highs and lows of the American dream. Here he explores his fight to build a family, confront his past, and to reclaim his identity. And it's interwoven with poignant poetry. We've heard some of it today. It's a story of resilience, self-discovery, and the enduring power of hope, a journey that will inspire readers to examine their own history, embrace their truth, and reconnect with what matters most, which to our author, Ryan McDermott, it seems what matters to him most are faith and family, and that these have been his guiding influences and inspirations for most of his life, and indeed in producing this book, which is filled with poetry and also a compelling personal story. Ryan, I'd be interested to know, are you working on, or have you had time to consider an upcoming project, or have you just been totally focused on promoting your current release?
I'm practically speaking, I'm focused on my current release. My plate's pretty full. My son Brandon just graduated college. My daughter just graduated high school, and I've got to put the sort of, I've got a day job as well, and I got to put, there's been a lot of focus on this. I got to continue to focus on my kids and my family. Lucy and so my family. At some point, I could see writing more, but I think the rollout for Downriver is still happening, and so that's kind of the focus right now, and then just making sure my kids are still on a good track. One's going into the Army; he's a newly minted second lieutenant. Another is a rising junior at University of Central Florida, and my daughter just graduated high school. So if I had more time, I'd definitely be, but perhaps someday if Downriver is successful.
Well, it's obvious you've been a tremendous leader to such a successful family. Thank you so much for being our special guest here today on Gray Matter, taking the time to talk to us about what sounds like it's a brilliant book, Downriver, Memoir of a Warrior Poet. I've ordered it myself. I'm looking forward to reading it. Just hearing some of the poetry and some of the reviews that it's received has really made me excited about reading it. I'm looking forward to reading it. Thanks for writing it. And thanks for taking the time to talk to us today about it. Ryan, wish you much continued success in everything that you do, and especially in your writing. And we hope that you do more of it.
Leighton, thanks for having me on today. Really appreciate it.